Well, I'm a Democrat. I'm a professional Democrat. I've been working in Democratic politics for 20 years, and I'm frustrated that we're not winning. And I'm frustrated that our worldview, our policy agenda isn't getting enacted. I'm frustrated that the people who are being left behind aren't being helped. And I got sick of spending election nights, my, my hands pressed together, hoping against hope that people would see the light, and not understanding why half the country, a little more, a little less, was just completely averse to my own worldview. Like, what was I missing? And the sort of general critique on the left that people have the wool pulled over their eyes, or they're gullible, or they're racist, or they're xenophobic. It's like some of that's certainly true in some circumstances, but it didn't explain why people who had been Obama voters turned into Trump voters.
Yeah. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Marc Dunkelman. And Marc is a fellow in international and public affairs. His work at Brown focuses on the architecture of American community and the progressive movement's evolving view of power. He is the author of Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back. And by the way, Marc, have you got a handy copy there? Because I read mine on Kindle. So sadly, I can't hold the book up and promote it, but I want to. So
Can you
hold
see?
that up and tell me the title again.
Yeah, it's called Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back.
Okay. And I'm going to ask you to haul it out once in a while here. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and to my Substack commentary page. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack. And this book, we're going to make it our selection for October. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read. And so we will re-promote it in October. I know it was published a little while ago this year, 2025, but I forget the month. When did it come out?
Came out February 18th.
Okay, close enough. And um, I'm always telling my wife when I look at my garden and everything growing in it, good tomato season this year, I said, it's hard to imagine what this looks like in mid-February. As you know, the Northeast, big
Yeah.
changes.
That's right.
Our
That's right.
producer, Ernie, lives in Arizona and his world always looks the same. But mine, it's impossible in March and February to imagine the summer. And the summer, it's like, does that really happen to us every winter? But it does. Yeah. So you get the scenario.
The wild swings, absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to talk about this book because first of all, I enjoyed it very much. It's a kind of a rip from the headlines thing, probably more than you would like, in the sense that so many people are wandering around asking, how did we get Donald Trump for president? And I think this book goes a long way to answering that with a series of ideas that are not the usual ones in terms of populism or the evangelical right, which I came from as a child and left, or these things. It deals with what I'll call the sort of Penn Station phenomena that you begin with in terms of what happened in New York City, and then you use that as a template. So what I did is, besides loving the book and wanting to make it part of our book club, I took the liberty of pulling some things out of the book in no particular order, that if I was your publicist for this book or the publisher looking for things to release, this is how I would kind of open the discussion. And these are pulled from various parts of the book. This book was written not to prescribe the specific changes that should be made in every realm of public policy, but to argue for a shift in narrative. But even if progressives aren't actually bent on tearing down every manifestation of public and private authority, the conservative criticism that progressives hate America draws strength from the naked reality of our cultural aversion to power. Conservative critiques may seem to those inside the movement as something close to preposterous. Progressives typically bill themselves as beacons of more government. But the public's recoil when Barack Obama suggested that red America was clinging to guns or religion, and when Hillary Clinton labeled some Trump supporters deplorables, didn't emerge from thin air. And then you say, beyond conservatism, populism, MAGAism, and whatever other forces are pushing in contrary directions, progressivism is undermining itself. The cultural aversion to power hasn't just tied government in knots, it has diminished the movement's broader appeal. It is at the root of contemporary progressive exasperation. Some will argue that's preposterous. Pointing to Trump and his supporters, they'll dismiss out of hand any notion that progressivism should be held culpable for its own frustrations. So I kind of set the book up that way because I want people to understand that this book is incredibly topical. It reads like a series of really good articles out of the Atlantic or the New Yorker in the sense that you tie it with stories into the moment we're in, but also with the history, um, Madison, Jefferson, and these other people that are kind of through lines. So I guess the first thing I'm going to ask you to do before we get into the specifics of what the book is about, and it's a really, 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 really important book, because I can tell you as someone who does, two podcasts a week and reads two books a week to do that, and I've talked to 100 authors and the editor of the Wall Street Journal and all sorts of interesting people. Probably the single most the most usual topic we eventually get to, no matter what the book is about, is how did we get here? We being basically people with a progressive point of view most of the time. Or I ask my right-wing conservative friends, like the editor of the Wall Street Journal, how do you think we got here? Because obviously the feckless Democrats are in real trouble right now. What gives? And I got to say, Mark, your book comes closer to answering that question in one place than anything I've read. It's like, yes, this makes sense to me. So we're going to unpack what the book says. But first, I want to talk about the background of the book. Why did you write this book? How did you get to this subject? I know you've been a consultant in Washington. You worked with Biden. You did all these things. Give us any background story you want to give us as to why you wrote the book.
Well, I'm a Democrat. I'm a professional Democrat. I've been working in Democratic politics for 20 years, and I'm frustrated that we're not winning. And I'm frustrated that our worldview, our policy agenda isn't getting enacted. I'm frustrated that the people who are being left behind aren't being helped. And I got sick of spending election nights, my, my hands pressed together, hoping against hope that people would see the light, and not understanding why half the country, a little more, a little less, was just completely averse to my own worldview. Like, what was I missing? And the sort of the sort of uh, uh, general critique on the left that people have the wool pulled over their eyes, or they're gullible, or they're racist, or they're xenophobic. It's like some of that's certainly true in some circumstances, but it didn't explain why people who had been Obama voters turned into Trump voters.
Yeah,
And so I wanted to understand it. And I just began thinking about it, and I began thinking about our agenda. Like, what is it that people are connecting with? What are we not saying that seems to be true? What are we what are we missing?
yeah,
And that all came together sort of in a strange way as I began commuting from Washington into New York, and then from Providence into New York, and reading various books, historical books about progressivism,
yeah,
and wondering why it was that Penn Station, the front door to New York's the front door to America's greatest city, to the
yeah, yeah,
global capital, was such a rat's warren.
yeah.
And could progressivism and its frustrations be explained in that analogy? And that's
Yeah,
what
and the thing is, the title of your book, it's interesting. I live on a street here in a little town in Massachusetts, and everybody thinks of this area of the North Shore as kind of liberal, but actually not. I'd say a third of my neighbors voted for Trump, some of whom are lifelong Republicans of Democrats would describe as the worst sort, but others simply very much in line with what you're writing about is, hey, nothing works. Let's try anything. Let's just try anybody who shakes this system up,
Yeah.
because obviously, whatever this is, it's not working. And then, of course, you cite the big examples. We can't build a high-speed train. Penn Station is a disaster, and we placed one of the most beautiful architectural creations in North America. and so forth. You go back into the history of New York and the big destruction of neighborhoods and all the rest of it, um, in terms of the way so many liberals and Democrats developed a kind of antipathy toward and suspicion of every government action. So between the right wing, which basically doesn't want to do anything in terms of government or make it all private enterprise, or so they say, even though they're using the government a lot right now to hound enemies of Trump and so forth. And then on the left, you outline these factors in a way I've never seen before. So one of the things that I wanted you to do, because it's important to your book, and then we'll get into a lot of details, is would you please spell out the whole Hamilton versus Jefferson thing that runs through the book? Let's start there because I found that very informative. I'd never quite thought of it that way. Can you just lay that out, and then let's get to what I'll think of as the kind of more timely specifics, but you can't really understand the book until you get into this Hamilton Jefferson thing. Would you just talk about that?
Sure. So Walter Lippmann, who was maybe the preeminent journalist of the 20th century,
Right.
had this phrase that he coined in the early 20s called that the world is so complex that we ordinary people develop pictures in our heads, stories in our heads that explain the world to us. And I think that progressives generally have two stories in their heads. And the first narrative is that there's some problem, some tragedy of the common. We don't have good roads, or don't have good schools, or don't have enough parks, or whatnot.
Yeah.
And the frustration of that is something that none of us individually can solve for ourselves. So power itself needs to be lifted into some institution above us that will do the thing that we all need done. Build the park, erect the school, plot the rail line or the electricity line. That's I call that a Hamiltonian idea because Alexander Hamilton wanted to create big, powerful institutions that would make America. He called it Hercules in the cradle
Yeah.
during that period, and the sort of notion that America could be a great thing if money and government and everybody were sort of rowing in the same direction, and that required leadership. So it means
Yeah.
taking power at the community level and putting it into some institution above us to do something great, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Social Security Administration, the Interstate Highway System, you name it, NASA. All of those are Hamiltonian institutions born from the Hamiltonian narrative that power needs to be moved up.
Yeah, and big ones coming out of the New Deal and the whole electrification of the South, and you go through all these great examples.
Correct. So that's one narrative that we progressives hold on to, our Hamiltonian narrative that power needs to be taken from where it is and be pushed up. But
Yeah.
there's a second narrative, and that's the Jeffersonian narrative. And the Jeffersonian narrative is not is essentially that there is a powerful institution above us that is abusive and coercive,
Hmm.
and that it is Jim Crow, or it is powerful banks, or it is the patriarchy, or it is some shadowy machine that
Hmm.
operates in the dark.
Daily
And
in Chicago, whatever.
yeah, whoever it is, and that the way to salvation to make America better is to take
Hmm.
that power that's been coalesced in some institution and push
Yeah.
it down to individuals. So that's
Yeah.
how we think of, for example, reproductive rights on the left, right? We don't
Right.
want some bureaucratic body telling a woman what she can and cannot do with her body.
Yeah.
We don't want Jim Crow bureaucrats in the South telling black people where they can and cannot drink from a drinking fountain.
Right.
I think that these are individual rights, and that the solution in public policy is to return power from
Hmm.
somewhere up top and move it back down to the individual so that people can live their best lives.
So to make something clear, which I think is a terrific point in your book, and rather than reading you your own book, I'm going to get you to explain this. What I had never understood before is how that Jeffersonian model and the Hamiltonian model combine in their worst moments, if you want to put it this way, into the stasis that we have now, in the sense that, by the time you strip power away from the big agencies or the government or whomever that you fear are abusing power because we don't want them to tell us what to do, on the one hand, then on the other hand, you've kind of paralyzed the ability to do a big thing, to do a program, to build a high-speed rail. So I'd like you to give us a little lecture here briefly on how, forget these things in themselves, but how have they come together, and give us some examples as you do in your book to strip us of the ability to get anything done. I mean, you're the author of a book about who killed progress and how to bring it back, why nothing works. And one of the reasons you tell the stories of, you illustrate very well how it is that nothing's working. But I think one of the brilliant through lines of your book is that you illustrate that this Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian thing that liberals have adopted, conservatives have adopted, and seesawed back and forth on again and again, have somehow combined to give us a situation where nothing does get done. Just that aspect in your book, I really would
Yeah.
like to drill down on it.
So my view is that like it's a pendulum, right?
Yeah,
And at one end is progressivism at its most Hamiltonian, and
yeah,
at the other is progressivism at its most Jeffersonian.
yeah,
And there was this period in the middle of the 20th century where progressivism was almost exclusively Hamiltonian or
yeah,
overwhelmingly Hamiltonian. And
yeah,
so our view generally was we have a problem, whatever it is, we trust the government to fix it. We
sure.
believe that experts and science and rationality and big bureaucracies doing the public's bidding, that that's the solution. And
Yeah,
that felt certainly, after the Great Depression, when the federal government came in and really was viewed to have saved the country from morass and from fascism.
yeah,
Then in the Second World War, when the government saved us from the specter of Nazism. Then in the sort of the post-war period, when the government is saving us from the specter of communism. In all these moments, we are pushing power into big, powerful bureaucracies. And for progressives, that seems like the right thing to do. We're going to create the interstate system and NASA and the Tennessee Valley Authority and you sort of name it. Like the narrative in our lives is how do we get more power into the hands of big government? That was
right.
what we thought. And then we get to this point in the late 60s, early 70s, where we see that these big bureaucracies, which we thought were going to do good, are not. That they
Hmm.
are spraying DDT on our crops and creating birth defects. That urban renewal is tearing down whole blocks of big cities and immiserating people. That the
Yeah,
highway system is destroying the urban fabric of lots of our great metropolises. The military industrial complex is sending us into a war that seems unwinnable. And finally,
yeah,
the Nixon administration gets involved in Watergate. That is clearly, it seems clear at that moment that the old
mm,
patriarchy, the old bureaucracy, the old system that we had
sure.
invested so much faith in for decades was in fact corrupt and bad.
Yeah,
So we move from this Hamiltonian notion, just like a whipsaw, into a Jeffersonian mold, where our idea is in order to save the republic, we're going to put new restrictions on these government bureaucracies that have
hmm,
all turned sour. We're going to make it
yeah,
much harder to build a highway through a congested minority neighborhood. We're going to make it much harder to build a railway by creating all sorts of new environmental standards. We're going to create new opportunities for people to sue, to have standing in court if they don't like what the local bureaucracy wants to do with their neighborhood. We're going to create all sorts of checks on centralized power.
yeah,
And it's been 50 years, and that's been out. That's been the story, as Walter Lippmann said, that was the story in our heads. The
yeah,
story in our heads was we are going to fix things by returning power to ordinary people.
yeah, yeah,
We've done such a thorough job of that,
yeah.
that today there are so many restrictions on government that you can't even get a good project going.
Yeah, and you worked for the Biden administration, of course. He was thinking big on a few projects, but it's not that those have quote come to nothing, but the original promise, even of those very recent projects, has not been realized. It is they've also either died the death of a thousand cuts, or they're enduring them now, or you talk about that in the book. Just give a few specific examples besides those more recent or less recent, as you like, of things that haven't worked. I mean, we've talked about high speed rail, and then one other thing I just want to throw in is the kind of unhigh-minded obstructionism where environmental laws are used to make sure there's not a homeless shelter next to my house because I demand another environmental study, whatever, that sort of NIMBYism. Just talk about that mix and bring us up to speed on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one great, it's not in the book, but I wrote about it in the Washington Post, is the story of Biden's effort to get electric vehicle chargers into the places
Yeah,
around the highway system around the country
yeah,
where it's not profitable to put the charger, but the
right,
drivers are
right.
fearful of buying an electric car because they think that if they're driving to grandma's house, they'll get stuck in the middle and won't have a place to charge. So
Sure.
Biden created a $7.5 billion program to put chargers in these remote places.
Yeah,
He doesn't have a federal workforce to do it, so he has to give the money to the states. The states then have to determine where the soft spots are in the system.
sure.
They then have to contract by, through competitive bidding to companies they don't know at all with
Yeah,
various standards to make sure that the chargers work in the right places. That money then has to flow through from the federal government to the state government to the charging company. The utility, the Biden administration has no control on, then has to connect this remotely placed
right,
charger in the
right.
middle of the right. So the Biden administration has put $7.5 billion behind this project, and 3 years later, when he leaves office, only 58 chargers have actually been brought online.
Yeah,
And if you are an ordinary person, an ordinary citizen who pays your tax bill every year and wants value for what you pay for,
yeah,
that sounds like a terrible deal.
right.
And we don't have the chargers. We cannot get any electrical vehicles that we needed from it. Like it seems like a lousy investment. And you compare that system of doing business for the government to what
Right.
FDR did when he wanted to string up poor farms in the Upper South through the Tennessee Valley Authority. He had a federal workforce,
Yeah,
right? They were federal workers. He had a guy, David Lilienthal, who ran the Tennessee Valley Authority. He did no environmental studies. He could claim people's property. He could do almost anything you wanted in that region, build dams, string
sure.
wires, reforest mountains, you name it, and there was no check on his power at all. Now, David Lilienthal is now viewed as a hero for the most part, but he's essentially exercising the same power that later characters like Robert Moses in New York or
Yeah.
Mulholland in LA, figures who would do things that people really didn't like.
Yeah, I mean, you use Moses as a good example to open the book with in terms of ripping up all these communities in New York, and he's going to put the freeway here, and that's the end of the story. Sort of what you might call in today's terms, the kind of Chinese Communist Party method of high-speed rail. We're not doing studies, we're just building it.
Correct. And so the frustration that people have now is that it was lousy when Robert Moses could build the Cross Bronx while
Right.
everyone screamed, "Please don't do it. Please don't ruin our neighborhood. Please don't
Yeah.
do this to us." There was and he turned a totally deaf ear to them because he didn't have to listen.
He didn't
The
have to.
the
Yeah.
the opposite is what we have now, where
Yeah, and what we
everybody.
have now, just to point out again to listeners, is not just something theoretical. It is the reason why Democrats don't win, because the one thing everybody agrees on, including many reformists within the Democratic Party, is that for whatever reason, Democrats can't govern. Is the sort of scuttlebutt on it. And at the beginning of the book, I just want to get back into something you say here early in the book to help set it up. This book comprises 8 chapters, the first 4 of which detail how progressivism evolved from a beacon of centralized authority into a movement culturally averse to power. And I breezed through that, but I just think that is a momentous summary of what happened. I'm going to read it again. First 4 chapters that detail how progressivism evolved from a beacon of centralized authority into a movement culturally averse to power. And you can't have both. You cannot want to do big things, change stuff, and then take the examples of where it blew up in our face and get so nervous that we then wind up with what the rest of your book is about, is giving us stories of how this didn't work out. The latter 4 chapters detail how this shift played out in various realms in the movement's efforts to regulate greedy corporations, to keep housing affordable, to build public works, to build clean energy future capable of thwarting climate change, and so forth and so on. Every chapter begins with a story designed to illustrate how the progressive schism um, has framed a certain moment or shaped the movement's approach to a certain challenge. So that's kind of how you set the book up, and then we'll get into quotes from later. But give me some more examples of how that schism has worked out in real time with a particular view to illustrating why we keep losing elections. In other words, how did Donald Trump win the election? And of course, he's an anomaly in one way, but progressivism isn't. And the same frustration you see with Trump, I happen to be an aficionado of British news and I read their newspapers and I listen to BBC World Service and Radio 4 because I went to school in the UK and have connections there. But, their complaints are ripped from your book. The new Labour government's in huge trouble. They can't do anything. And it's very much the same syndrome. So this is not unique to the United States. This is the battle between progressives who run the EU. My daughter happens to be an energy consultant to the European Union, and she has offices in Brussels and so forth. So I'm kind of in on that. But they can't get anything done either. So this is not just something playing out in Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian terms in the United States. This is Western civilization we're talking about.
Yeah, what we're talking about is who should decide things, right? Fundamentally, you've got a problem.
Yeah,
You name the problem, and you as a progressive or any progressive will have in their heart and in their mind probably two different ideas
yeah,
about who would best be equipped to solve the problem. Is the problem best solved at the individual level, where we all have our own choice as to where to buy a home or where to go to the bathroom or where we're going to stay for the night when we're traveling across the country. We want people to have individual rights and be protected against a coercive, overbearing, bigoted, patriarchal government.
yeah,
We all would agree to that. And we would also agree that if you're going to build a new high-speed rail line, the
mhm,
trick of it is not the kind of train that you put on the tracks or even the composite metal of the tracks themselves. It is how straight are the rights of way.
sure,
You have to, if you go around a curve, you have to slow your train. So fast trains are straight. The Northeast Corridor, which is the bulk of traffic in
yeah,
America, going between Boston and Washington, with New York and Philadelphia in the middle, that is a train line that was cobbled together during periods where we were using old diesel steam
yeah,
powered engines. So the tracks are not straight at all.
yeah,
Imagine trying to straighten that track. All of the things that the people whose houses are in the way, or whose golf courses are in the way, or
yeah,
whose old bucolic main streets are in the way. Those places, the question is who should decide? Should those places be preserved, even if it means people are taking very slow trains?
yeah,
Or does some person, institution, authority, bureaucracy, should somebody have the ability to say, these number of homes are going to need to be taken
yeah,
on the one hand. On the other, if we build this train line, then hundreds of thousands of car miles of carbon emitting vehicle
yeah, vehicles,
miles
sure.
traveled will be reduced because people will be on a fast train that is electrically powered rather than in an internal combustion car. That's
It
like
was
that's
interesting
not
in reading the book. You had a couple of what I would call subheadings. You have trains today. Many will find it difficult to appreciate the degree to which the railroad industry emerged during the late 19th century to become for America what the Catholic Church had been to medieval Europe, an institution so suffused with power and so central to everyday life that its decisions rippled across the whole fabric of American society. By the way, you write beautifully. That's a typical paragraph of the book, and you're okay. So who would think, okay, I'm going to compare the power of the Catholic Church in medieval Europe to the railroad industry in the United States in the 1800s or whatever. The ensuing economic turmoil eventually connected to something deeper, something cultural. The late 1800s were awash in tension centering on questions of immigration, urbanization, racism, among other topics. So you kind of broaden it out. And then electric power. And like a conquistador bringing news of the Savior to the New World's pagans, this was someone who was bringing the electric power, was determined to proselytize the miracle of rational administration to the victims of free enterprise. Centralized public power would connect for a system that didn't work. And while other realms of the New Deal, Jeffersonianism would carry a brighter torch. In this corner of Roosevelt's agenda, Hamiltonianism won the day. And then you get down to, in your conclusion of those sort of things, you talk about the fact um, if America faces today in other articles of Confederation moment, if, as this book has argued, public power has been diffused too thoroughly for government to deliver, progressivism will need to shift course yet again. So I want to just get to that in that what you talk about in the book, but just off the book as well, what you feel as someone who's been in government, working for people like Joe Biden, has been writing this book and researching it. In the best of all worlds, how would you see balancing this dispute between the kind of libertarian NIMBYism on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the idea that we've got to do big things or perish, not just economically, but even ecologically. If we had a leader who could step up and do this the right way, he would or she would need to step on some toes. Someone's going to lose that golf course, and there is going to be a straight rail line through it. On the other hand, how would you balance that in terms of it doesn't all go to private contractors. And I'll give you an example of where something seems to be off the rail to me. And that is reading article after article about how NASA is no longer our space agency, but Elon Musk is. And you have this one guy now, like the old railroad barons, who's going to become the industry. Um, does that mean we shouldn't have a space program? It's gone so far in the favor of one private entrepreneur and so on. So there's real things happening that jump to mind as examples. In the best of all worlds, how would you balance this out? I mean, if you could just do it, what would you do? What's the
Well,
best alternative?
let me just so you're not so we're not misleading your listeners. I worked for Joe Biden, but when he was in the Senate, so I'm not a former
You weren't part of the
administration.
presidential thing. Yeah.
Right. And as a very, very junior Biden staffer 20
Yeah,
years
but
ago.
nevertheless, it's good. It's a good calling card. You've been out there, you've been doing things.
But exactly. So the phrase that I would use is that everyone should have a voice, but no one should have a veto. So
Yeah.
the problem with Robert Moses and that style of Hamiltonian progressivism was that no one had a voice. That
Yeah.
Moses was going to do his thing almost no matter what. And the brilliance of Robert Caro's biography of Moses, which is sort of the central tome, it's called The Power Broker,
Sure.
that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1975. The brilliance of that book is that it reveals how Moses collected power from all
Mm.
sorts of sources, put it in sort of a single scepter, and was able, with that power, to deflect any sort of criticism or demand that he adjust his plans,
Yeah.
with exceptions. But in too many cases, he was able to turn a deaf ear to people that wanted to have a voice, that had legitimate gripes, and where there were reasonable alternatives.
Yeah.
Uh, that he could have, for de minimis inconvenience for the traveling public, routed expressways so that they did not destroy neighborhoods, and he didn't care.
Yeah.
Other end of the spectrum, at the other end of this pendulum swing, is one in which anyone who has even the slightest objection to a big public work
Yeah.
has the ability to veto it, right? That
Yeah.
they can file an environmental lawsuit, they can claim that the government's decision on the route was arbitrary and capricious. They can say that they didn't study this thing or that thing, that there are going to be negative environmental consequences, that there's an endangered species of orchid that's going to be eliminated if we do this project, whatever it is, to the point that whether or not they prevail in court, they've delayed the project so much that it's much more expensive. It makes it
Sure.
impossible to do other projects, and the person who's championing it may give up. Those are the two extremes. And it's for you and me and your listenership to think of what would be a fair process.
Yeah.
If you were to say to a group of 20 people, like, we need to create some new route from
Yeah.
point A to point B. We need to extend an electricity line from point A where there's cheap, clean energy to point B where they're dependent on fossil fuels. We're going to create some sort of process by which we choose what the route is, or we'll choose not to do it. But we want, at the end of the day, for even those who don't like the outcome, to
Right.
feel as if they've been heard, that they had a fair hearing, that the person that ultimately decided took their concerns to heart. And
Yeah.
realistically, we need a process like that, right? Where everyone feels like even if they don't get what they wanted, even if it ends up that their
Sure.
golf course is sacrificed to the straight right of way for a fast train, that at least they've had a fair hearing and someone has said, for the good of the country, we
Yeah.
need this slice of land so that people are out of their cars and we're not spewing unnecessary carbon into the atmosphere. The, that process exists in all of our lives. I love to tell a story. When my kids were a little younger, my wife would get home from work on a Friday night and she'd say, I don't want to cook, and I certainly don't. I certainly didn't want to cook, and so we'd say to the kids, "Let's go out to dinner." And then it was the four of us, my 8-year-old, my 11-year-old, my wife, and me, and we would have to decide where to go to dinner. And we
Mhm.
had wildly different proclivities, right? The 8-year-old just wanted donuts for dinner, and the 11-year-old always wanted a fried chicken sandwich, and my wife always wanted, some sort of weird vegetarian food. And the question in that moment is like, what is a fair system
Sure.
so that we everyone gets feels as though they are concerned. So now, in that case, it might be that the parents get to choose every time because we know what's healthy. It could be that you decide that everyone should
Yeah.
get everyone should get the successive turn. So one out of every four times we're eating donuts for dinner. It could be that you make a system where everyone gets to throw out an idea and then the other people can veto it, which is essentially what American society has developed. And what it means is that Helen, my 8-year-old, who only
Yeah.
wanted donuts, would realize at a certain point that she could just veto everyone else's suggestion
Yeah. Yeah.
until she got her donuts, right? So we need some sort of system, as in a family, where everyone can be heard, everyone's ideas and concerns are taken seriously, but then at the end of that deliberative process, someone is given the authority to make the call. And it's not going to be a call that has no negatives, right? These are hard decisions.
Sure.
We're weighing different public goods, but it can't be that everyone who has a slight quibble with
Yeah.
whatever project is proposed is able to shut it down. And that's the situation we're in now.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to float an idea past you, and I'm not saying this is my idea and trying to get you to um, discuss it, but I really sometimes wonder this, and that is that in the same way that your book looks at this situation that we're in, where we can't get anything done. By the way, hold the book up again and read the subtitle
Sure, let's see.
if I can
Oh,
reintroduce it.
there
Yeah.
it is. Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back.
Yeah, and by the way, the only reason I'm not waving your book around is because I read it on Kindle, and that way I can cut and paste my notes efficiently. Otherwise, I can't. But I want to go to kind of a philosophical question because you're an observer of American politics. I come from a religious right background. My father was working with Dr. Siebert Koop, who was Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General back in the 70s and 80s, and really at beginning, most historians say the evangelical involvement in the pro-life movement, the anti-abortion movement. I was very much his nepotistic sidekick at that time, although in my 20s and so forth. So not exactly the same guy who's sitting here at age 73. But that said, that arc of my life has given me a particular ear and sensitivity for the world from which MAGA comes. At least it's in its white evangelical roots. I understand those people. I grew up with them and so on. And it seems to me that one of the problems with the progressive movement, aside from what your book is about, and this is what I want to run by you, is that where it looked for the big achievements, in other words, the equivalent of building, the the power infrastructure in the South in the Roosevelt years, or when we used to do big things, it sort of began to focus on culture war issues that basically gave it a sense of forward momentum. For instance, Roe v. Wade, and I'm pro-choice. It's not a discussion of abortion here, but just tactics, looking to the courts to kind of end run the democratic process, whether it was Roe or other initiatives, gay marriage, of which I'm in favor, and so forth. But nevertheless, there was a shift in energy so that it's like, no, we're making all kinds of progress here. We've gay rights and civil rights, and women are doing better, and so forth. We'll take those as our big wins. And in the meantime, the world everybody actually lives in, which is not just the idea of lobbyists and ideas and feminism and gay rights and so forth, but it's like going through Penn Station every day on your way to work and looking at this, or, potholes in the road or other infrastructure projects that aren't happening around where I live. there's this kind of evidence, or the failure of the public school system in many areas of the country, and all these other things, or even the sense of frustration of parents who were saying, well, what do we do about the iPhone? It's as if somehow they'd come from outer space and you hadn't given them to your kid, that it's someone else's problem. All these kind of rising frustrations, I think, had a lot to do with the fact that the left quit concentrating on making people's lives better, where most people spend most of their time, which is not worrying about pronouns, but worrying about how long it takes to commute to Boston every morning to work. And the infrastructure, that's where the frustration is. And it's like, okay, whoever comes along and says they can fix this at fell swoop, we'll give them a whirl. So what do you think about that sort of trade in energy and effort to culture war issues? And I'm not looking at the issues themselves, but just where the energy went, as opposed to getting things done that actually make a difference to where 90% of the people live every day. Just take the commute to Boston, that takes you an hour and a half to go 30 miles, or take the train that takes an hour and 10 minutes. Whereas where I grew up in Switzerland, to go exactly the same distance to work, which my nephew does every day, takes 22 minutes because he's on a high speed rail that works, that runs every 15 minutes, and a road system that works. And, he doesn't get up every day feeling angry.
So I want to say two things. The first of which is probably less consequential, but I'll say it. There's an ugly underside to our movement, which looks down on the people that you grew up among.
Yeah.
Even when Roosevelt was supporting the Tennessee Valley Authority in the Upper South, his idea was not just that he was going to deliver a good to poor people who were suffering because were not yet connected to the grid. It was that he was going to civilize those people.
Mm-hmm.
He viewed himself as sort of a country squire, and these sort of the sort of hoi polloi that were living in the mountains
Yeah.
needed a little touch of his magic. And you see that, I think a lot about the Scopes trial, and I think it's been misunderstood by a lot of us on the left, like the degree to which
Sure.
it was even in the 1920s, the educated elite pushing their ideas on people who had a different view of science. The Tennessee, just as a sort of an aside, Tennessee in the Scopes trial was not mandating the teaching of creationism in the schools. It
Mm-hmm.
simply disallowed the teaching of evolution. And that was just apostasy to those who lived in sort of more educated upper class and middle
Sure.
class portions of the country. And it was an effort to push our cultural proclivities on a population that didn't want it. Like they hadn't voted it in their local level, they hadn't voted it in to the state board of education or the state legislature. Like they wanted to keep evolution out, not to keep religion, but they wanted to keep evolution out, which of course was a theory then, and so it felt like an unproven theory, and we didn't like that. So that's something that we need to own. And you can see right from there to the Obama comment or the Clinton comment that you cited earlier. That is a feeling that has existed in the country, certainly among those
Yeah.
who are evangelical, white working class for generations and generations. That's not a new thing. The second thing I'd say, which is sort of more relevant to your point, is that the elements that we as a movement have focused on since the 70s are all elements that are derivative of the Jeffersonian worldview.
Yeah.
That there is a powerful patriarchy that is keeping down African Americans, that is keeping down women, that is keeping down people in the gay and lesbian community, whatnot. Our sort of core desire to speak truth to power both flowed through our desire to stop the Robert Moses figures and the
Mm-hmm.
William Bill Mulholland figures and the Richard Daley figures and the Richard Nixons and the Lyndon Johnsons. Generally, like our general worldview, the story in our heads was there are powerful people who are doing coercive things to powerless people. That meant denying black people the ability to vote or to buy a home through redlining, or it meant denying women tenure because of sexism, or it meant
Sure.
denying people who were gay the ability to profess their love through marriage in a way that's sanctioned by the government. And those issues fit into the same worldview that viewed America's sort of patriarchy as inherently suspect. So the
Yeah.
cultural aversion to power that I talk about in the book applies equally to the sort of world of infrastructure as
Yeah.
it does to the world of culture. And so you're right. I mean, there is an element, the ugliness of the progressivism's view of the people who lived in Dayton, Tennessee during the 1920s, or of Roosevelt's view of the people in the Upper South who he was civilizing through his Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt had an opportunity during his early tenure to stand strong on lynching legislation. There was a terrible lynching on the eastern shore of Maryland,
Sure.
and there was a lot of pressure from the NAACP and other black leadership organizations for him to take a harder stand. And I think
Yeah.
there was some decision he needed to make, whether he was going to campaign on the issue or sign legislation that might be passed in Congress against, sort of a civil rights bill there in the 1930s. And Eleanor Roosevelt said to the advocates, like, he can't do it. If he does it, he won't be
Mhm.
able to do all of these other things that he wants to do economically. And like
Yeah.
that's a moral quandary, right? It's very easy for us to say that he should have signed the anti-lynching legislation. And lynching is, of course, this terrible scourge on American history and on our tradition. Um, but like in the same way that there are choices to be made about where the rail line is going to go, there are these
Sure.
competing political priorities. And the priority for progressives over the last 50 years, for good reason, but perhaps to excess now, has
Yeah.
been that we are in all manner very worried about the coercive power of government. And it's to the point where government doesn't work, which is itself a scourge for Democrats.
So talk a little bit about the irony that you do in your book touch on here. So this is not off the subject of your book, but let's get to this irony of uh, the fact that we've had this conflict in the progressive movement, and we would all agree on one thing: the balance between the Jeffersonian and the Hamiltonian view, blah blah blah, and so forth and so on. All of which is true, and you make a great case for in the book all the stories that back it up, and that we can't get anything done, why nothing works. But the result of this is that Trump is president and is now the most radical remaking of the US government we've seen, certainly in my lifetime. I'm 73. Nothing comes close. Nixon's Watergate seems like a footnote compared to this. The undoing of everything that we just took for granted. And there's a sort of a triple irony there because, yes, my evangelical cohort put him in power, but so did a big chunk of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans vote for him because they too live in this culture where all the frustrations of not being able to get big things done has impacted them massively. Um, in terms of high crime areas and jobs and all the rest of this, but also, again, going back to those culture war issues that the left sort of assumes, oh, well, these are black people, they're brown people, they'll vote for our guys because Trump's a racist. Yeah, but they're also pro-lifers and they don't believe in gay marriage and they come from Hispanic Pentecostal culture of religion or Roman Catholic backgrounds. And there's this been sort of aversion on the left to deal honestly with who, quote, these people are. They're not all one group. So, how do you explain the irony that this aversion to power has put Trump in power? How did that happen? I mean, how does this wind up the worst possible of all scenarios being the result of liberal slash progressive inability to get things done? And now everything we feel suspicious of has not only happened, but has doubled down and turned into the Trump presidency and the MAGA movement. I mean, this has got to be one of the great reversals of history.
I mean, I was listening to Bernie Sanders do an interview not long ago, and he was asked about people's frustration. And he said, well, I'll tell you the reason that the problem is that everything is corrupt. The whole system is corrupt. The oligarchs run everything, and well, if the oligarchs run everything and government is there, why would you ask or believe as a voter that giving more power to government would get us
Yeah,
out of this mess? If everything's so corrupt and government is already there, then why would you give more power to the people that can't build roads, can't build high-speed rail,
yeah,
housing? And uh, I think that again, this gets back to the stories in your heads. Democrats are selling a lemon product, right? Like if government
sure.
is working and we're asking people to give government more power, it doesn't make
Yeah,
any actual sense. And so whatever your background is, if you are white, if you're Hispanic, if you're black, if you're mixed, if you're religious, if you're not religious,
yeah.
that's a lousy political position to be in. And
Yeah,
Trump,
and I think Bernie Sanders is very illogical in that because, again, as I say, I'm an aficionado of British news, and of course, he's a pale imitation of the British left. But nevertheless, this idea that somehow, government is utterly corrupt, power corrupts absolutely. So give us so much power that we can become a socialist country, and the government will run everything, and we'll give you grocery stores in Manhattan as well to sell food less, and we'll regulate rent prices, and we'll take over everything. We've screwed up everything, so let us, we can fix it by more power. And that's where Bernie Sanders and AOC and some of the people on the left of the Democratic Party are going to fall short radically and will never win an election if any of those folks are running. And you didn't say that, I did, but there has to be a better way to recalibrate what you're talking about than that. I mean, that's just my opinion.
I mean, I think that there is a general sense in American culture that government is the DMV at its worst day. You go
Right.
in, you've brought three documents all proving that you live where you live, and you wait in line for an hour and a half, and the clerk wearing their lanyard and their short sleeves says to you, "Oh no, we need four documents proving your residency." And you have
Yeah.
to go back and schedule another appointment. That's what government, that's in the public imagination, that's what government is. And
Yeah.
that it would make sense that a government that operated like that can't build a train station, can't build a rail line, can't get clean power on the grid, can't build enough housing so that we can all afford our mortgages or rents or whatever we have.
Yeah.
And so the challenge for progressives, it seems to me, is to take a bunch of singles and doubles rather than announce grand plans to remake the world as it is, as frustrating as the world is, we need to build small systems that work, that are responsive, that
Yeah.
make decisions expeditiously about things where there is public discomfort, right?
Well, for instance, just give you an example of a small thing that might happen. Rather than trying to imitate the British national healthcare system, which, by the way, is in complete chaos right now and falling completely apart, and having a single payer system, which Bernie Sanders wanted, the solutions the left offers, unfortunately, have been tried everywhere before, and not just in this country, but they don't have a good track record. And as someone who has stood in line at the DMV for a license and had to go back and get more documents, I'm always glad to go to Massachusetts General Hospital and get my checkup where it's not run as a government institution. And I'm not about to change that, even though I know there's tremendous iniquity in the way our healthcare system works. But I am your average American in that the idea of the government taking the whole thing over and suddenly becoming the entity, I don't know one area of my life where that works at this point as well as, say, the parts that work better, um, that I'm still grateful for. So I think your point is good, and that the progressive movement is going to have a tremendously difficult time on a general national level selling more government involvement in ordinary parts of our lives. I don't know if that's what you're saying or not.
Yeah, I'm saying that our brand, rather than being for more government or more government control, should be value for the taxpayer dollar. Because
Yeah,
certainly people are not going to be getting good value from the Trump administration, right?
right.
We're already seeing them, take a sledgehammer to bureaucracies that provide real value to people that people probably have underappreciated. But but that are important in our lives in ways that have been invisible, and people are going to feel that
Yeah,
eventually. What I
exactly.
like to say, but I mean, there's a terrific project at NYU called the Transit Cost Project, where they show that the Second Avenue subway in New York City per mile was 6 times what it was, and in Spain, to build a couple of miles in Houston was the cost of building all the way across Madrid. So, like, we know there are systems where government can be an effective steward.
Yeah,
Uh, of taxpayer dollars, and people get the things that they want. That someone makes the difficult choice about where the railroad should run or the
yeah,
electricity line should be posted. Um, but that should, rather than claiming that we're going to completely change the political economy of the Western world, we need to just focus on the nuts and bolts of making government work because nobody's doing that.
yeah.
And we've got a long history of government being pretty effective when we focus on these things. We just haven't been focused on it for a half century.
Do you see anybody out there who is talking about this that has any credentials to actually guide us? I'm not asking you to make a presidential pick or a congressional pick, but it seems to me that that very discussion you bring up, there are other books about it that are out right now, is just becomes another bone of contention in the Democratic Party. Okay, now we'll fight about that. But I don't see any, cohesion and unity in addressing what you're talking about. I just see Bernie Sanders doing his thing, AOC is doing hers. Other people, are talking about not having trans athletes in sports. And if we do that, we can get elected again. But I don't see a unified message coming from the Democratic Party with a kind of a leadership that will inspire. And, I don't want to be a pessimist, but I think unless something changes, we're going to be looking at JD Vance and all these other people waiting in the wings all the way down because Trump's immense corruption, Bitcoin, all the rest of it, um, the prices will go up. The economy is going to have a problem. I really think so. But that said, I don't think the Democrats are making a case for voting for a progressive agenda. I see them fighting amongst ourselves. I don't know. How do you see that?
I'm more optimistic than you are. I think that if you go through, the Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania is well known now explicitly because he rebuilt I-95 when it collapsed
Yeah,
in record time. And Jared Polis is about good governance in Colorado, and we've got folks, the Governor Whitmer in Michigan, and J.B. Pritzker and Rahm Emanuel. There are a lot of people who are coming to this issue. I think that you'll see in the coming primaries and probably right after the midterm elections, that we'll have a bunch of big arguments. I think it's very healthy for the left to have big arguments about
yeah,
this. We'll see what prevails among the Democratic electorate. But like in the way that you've responded to my argument, which is that like things aren't getting done and no one has been talking about this.
yeah,
I almost always get that response. People are like we're having the fights that they have on cable news networks and having those conversations too often, and then someone just changes the subject and talks about this.
yeah,
This sort of frustration that it doesn't seem like government can get things done. It's completely outside the realm of the political discourse right now, but it's beginning to enter. And you've
yeah.
got Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein's book Abundance, and Yoni Applebaum's book Stuck, and Jen Polka's book last year. And next year there's going to be a book by Nick Bagley about how progressives have sort of created a procedure fetish in government. I think that this is going to bubble up into the main of the discourse. Some people aren't going to like it.
Well,
Some
you reminded me quite a bit of Stuck. I didn't want to, we're talking about your book, so I didn't want to be promoting somebody else's. But two things reacted to Stuck. One was the book itself, which I liked, and your book, which I really, really like. And I think I learned so much from you, but that I hadn't thought of. And I'm so grateful for you writing it, which is why we're going to make it part of our book club in October. But I also note that the loudest voices, the most clickbaity voices on the left, immediately zero in on books like Stuck, and I imagine on your book as well, saying, "Yeah, but we've got to still be doing this stuff." So I think as long as Bernie Sanders is spokesman for a sort of a British style left wing socialism as applied to America, which is basically his whole shtick, And, he's talking to a Democrat voting Americans who don't happen to listen to BBC Radio 4 every day like I do, and who literally chart the pettiness of the total disintegration of the national healthcare system, which is happening now as the doctors are on strike again, by the way. Um, the young consultants and these people, there's a disconnect here. So when people like you stand up and say, look, we've got to address these things, the first thing that happens is people on the left of the left immediately target you and say you're apostate. So they'd rather talk about your ideological purity than whether we can ever win an election again. And I feel that's a tremendous problem. I don't want to tax you with the answer, but is that a thing, or am I just more pessimistic than you are?
Well, I think that social media warps our views. That
Yeah,
well, then the small dollar donation world of people who are really motivated by politics,
yeah,
that warps our sense of who's voting and how America has changed, how our
yeah,
ideology has evolved. My view, you're right that there is sort of some left-right um, or center left moderate versus far left socialist discourse in the party. My view is that, like, in the end, um, if you believe in a single payer system, I don't. It sounds like you don't either. But if you believe that that's the way that we should go, then the first thing you need to do is restore faith in government. And
yeah,
that's what I think people who've written Abundance or Yoni Alabama who wrote Stuck and we're just making an argument that the government doesn't work and that we can have fights about the shape of the healthcare system and what
sure,
reforms we need to do down the line. First, if progressivism is going to win, all of us need to make sure that the things the government does do now, it
work.
does competently. And so
And
I,
by the way, I think that's a huge point, and it can't be made enough because that's not what people are talking about. They're talking about the details of the program. Do they like single payer? Do they not? As if that's the thing. But of course, it's not the thing because if it's like if every single time this and that airline flies, two-thirds of their planes crash, the problem is not how to talk you into flying. The problem is you're not flying that airline, and people don't trust the US government to efficiently get things done.
right. We need to build and we need to articulate a system. We need to articulate how it is that we're going to build systems that make hard decisions.
Mhm.
How do we give everyone a voice without a veto? How do we make it so that when we need to build a high-speed rail line, we've got some system by which we put out the alternatives, have a robust discussion, and then choose so that people feel as though their tax dollars are being spent competently and that they are getting the value that they're paying into the system.
Yeah,
And
and
so,
I just to reiterate what you're saying, because I think it's so important, and that is it's all very fine coming up with the new program we've got to do, whether it's rent control or, you know, state-run grocery stores or whatever it is. But until we get people in the mood to support anything government does, because they see it working in their lives, we're going to have a hard time pitching these programs. And if the left is identified with just more programs without how government addresses them, it's completely self-defeating. And I think that's what your book is talking about.
I mean, the fear on the left now for the better part of a decade is, do we have this sort of fifth column of fascists that's going to take over the country?
Yeah.
And we live moment to moment, and we live election to election, holding on to our chairs, thinking, what will it take to convince these people that Trump is bad?
Yeah.
Sitting here is like, yes, like that's real, but at the same time, we're not focused on the thing that we can control, which is
Mhm.
our own governing agenda. We've sort of lost sight of the fact that the thing that we're selling isn't working. And the most powerful thing that we could do to thwart Trump's popularity is to be the party that delivers good governance. Like that's in the end what I think people probably among your peers
Yeah.
from childhood want from government more than these culture war issues. They want the government to work. That they need, if the farming system isn't working and they can't make a profit with the crops that they are selling, they need help from the government to shape the market, and
Yeah.
government should do it competently. If you're commuting from the North Shore of Massachusetts into Boston and you can't get in, and there's nowhere for a business that's growing in the seaport in Boston to house its middle income workers, and so they decided they're going to move to Chicago. We need government to be able to solve that problem.
Right.
And whether you're left, right, or center on sort of on these cultural issues, the question is on sort of the substance of it. Do we have a governing agenda that speaks to people's desire just for competent administration? And I just think like if we were to get there, we would be in a completely different place.
Yeah, and had that been our track record for the last 50 years, these are the guys that can make things work. You would not be replaced by a no pun intended sort of trumped up con artist who is who basically drove all his own businesses into the ground and went bankrupt numerous times and has done not much more than enrich himself while in office and sign all these directives and so forth. So let me just plug the book here again and wrap this up. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaefer, and we're talking about why nothing works. And by Marc Dunkelman, and we're going to make it our book club offering in October. Um, and the only thing is that I would ask a favor to you, Marc. I'm going to sign off here in a minute. But before you do, please stay on for another moment and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, because we would like to ask you a couple things. One, how can we promote your book and tie it into our book club? But also, are there people we should be talking to that you can make an introduction to? Some of our best guests, and they don't have to be famous or authors or anything, come because there's someone we haven't thought of who's done some thinking in an area that you now know I'm interested in because we've just been talking about your book. So talk to Ernie, and if you can give us a few names and make some introductions, that would be great. That would really help us out.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
And once again, this is an incredible book. I learned a lot from it. I really enjoyed reading it. You're a really good writer, and you bring up incredible examples that are just like you wouldn't think of, federal policy and the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, whatever it may be. So thank you for writing a book that's both entertaining and instructive, but also I think brings up the point. I mean, this is the big point. How do we get anything done so that Democrats can ever win another national election and change our reputation? If people want to change something, I would just say what's in your book is a really, 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 really important contribution to the story. So thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. So stick around and talk to Ernie.
Take care.
Thanks, Marc.